Welcome to this presentation, the Representative Studies Rubric, 12 Steps to Enhance the Representation of Women and Underrepresented Populations in HIV Research. My name is Brian Minalga, and I work at the Office of HIV/AIDS Network Coordination based at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. And we support these 4 large HIV research networks that are funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. The contents of this presentation are solely my own and do not represent the official views of the US NIH, and I want to acknowledge these individuals and working groups whose contributions have made this work possible. So let's talk about representation in HIV research. We know that as a whole, HIV clinical research is not representative of the global HIV epidemic. One paper published in 2020 found that cisgender white men make up 6% of the global HIV epidemic, yet they represent 51% of participants in randomized controlled trials for new antiretrovirals. So this paper gives us one example of this problem of disproportionality and representation in HIV clinical research. Furthermore, it's underrepresented populations who suffer consequences when they're excluded from research. We're talking specifically about cisgender women, transgender people, pregnant people, and people who inject drugs in the global context, and Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people in the United States and territories. And when we talk about consequences of exclusion, of course, the most obvious example of a consequence would be when a drug or intervention is not able to be approved for a particular population due to that population's exclusion from the research. And this has happened in some of these populations listed here in recent years. So we had a question because we have been working on this issue of representation since 2009, releasing guidance documents, trainings, publishing in academic journals. So we wanted to know to what extent are our resources actually being implemented to help address this problem of representation within our research networks. So we went back and looked at our resources with the goal of designing some sort of tool or checklist that we could apply to individual study protocols, the blueprints by which these studies are designed and implemented. So we came up with these different domains that came to the surface: age, ethnicity, gender, injection drug use, pregnancy, race, and sex assigned at birth. And what we came up with was a 12-item questionnaire that looks at these different domains of representation pertaining to eligibility, as well as various processes within each protocol to support better representation. What I'm showing you here are just the abbreviated versions of the 12 items on the questionnaire. I will share during the live portion of this presentation the full 12-item questionnaire, a link to that so you can see that on your own time. We then applied this 12-item questionnaire to 47 of our study protocols. This represented 100% of protocols within our research networks listed here that were enrolling at the time of this analysis, September 2021. So some key findings when we applied this tool to these protocols that were already in the field. This is a slide that shows inclusion and exclusion, or eligibility, of these populations. So I'll draw your attention first to the blue bars. These represent studies that included the population on the y-axis. So for example, there were 41 studies that we found to include cisgender women, 23 included transgender women, and so forth. The next category are these gray textured bars. These represent studies where the population was excluded, but there was a reason stated in the protocol or a rationale as to why that population was excluded. For example, if a study was only designed for transgender women, that would be an exclusion that is justified for cisgender women. The red bars represent studies where the population was excluded, but no justification or rationale was stated in the protocol for that population's exclusion. So as you can see, transgender communities face the highest rate of exclusion within protocols with no justification or rationale stated. And this last category in black, for persons who inject drugs and pregnancy, These were protocols that stated a reason for the exclusion of those populations, but our team felt that the reason stated was insufficient for the blanket exclusion of the entire population. We also found that setting specific and measurable enrollment goals is an underutilized tool. For example, there were 14 protocols that set a goal for the enrollment of cisgender women, for example, a specific number or percentage of cisgender women who should be recruited as part of the study. But very few, in fact, only one study set enrollment goals by race or ethnicity. It was just one study that had an enrollment goal for Black Americans. None had enrollment goals for American Indians or Alaska Natives, and none had enrollment goals for Latinx Americans. So an underutilized tool is setting enrollment goals within the protocol. We also found that the majority of the studies incorrectly defined the study population by gender identity and sex assigned at birth. One of our groups released some guidance on how we should be doing this a couple years ago, and only 11 of the protocols correctly applied that guidance to clearly define the study population by gender identity and sex assigned at birth. We also found that the majority of our studies had a statistical plan for analyzing gender and sex as variables, so this was a positive finding. We do have some recommendations on clarifying how exactly gender and sex should be included in the statistical plan, but this was a great finding that most of our studies are already thinking about this. And lastly, we looked at stigmatizing language. There's a guide that was produced by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and when applied to these protocols retrospectively, we found that all 47 protocols included at least one instance of stigmatizing language, which can be a barrier for some populations to participate. And I've included some of those big culprits here on the slide. So in conclusion, we found that institutionalized barriers exist within study protocols that may perpetuate the underrepresentation of certain populations. Inclusion efforts are there but are differentially operationalized, meaning for one population for another, there may be a difference in how inclusion efforts are implemented. And existing guidance is not fully optimized. So what we'd like to see next, the big one, is to implement this RSR, these 12 questions, as a protocol development tool. What I've just shown you is a retrospective view at how protocols are performing that are already out there, but we'd like to see these 12 questions asked of each study protocol being implemented within our networks. And we've put together a variety of initiatives to ensure that this happens. Thank you for your time. I look forward to discussion.